Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome aboard. We are gonna get jumping straight in. It's been a while since we've had a class for Purim and the wedding and the journeys, Baruch Hashem, for Simchas. But this is going to be our class before Pesach, because next week and the week after is going to be the Pesach Rush. 2 weeks tonight is actually Seder night, believe it or not. Man Seder, we can't wait, I'm sure. I'm sure you enjoy me one way or another in saying that Pesach has to do with story, either because of the slavery side and the lead up, or because of the freedom that we celebrate on Pesach. Maybe it's connected through working so hard before. It helps us better appreciate what freedom is supposed to look like. But it's a very special time. So we're going to do a little bit about Pesach tonight. And before we get into that, we're going to start off with doing our usual 3-step program. So we'll start off with what's going on in the Parshah. We'll go on from there to what's going on in the Jewish calendar. And from there, we'll go to one practical, relevant life message, which will be from Pesach, because we're going to make it into a Pesach shir. So let's start off with what's going on in the Sedra, because that's the easy bit. And from there, we'll go into what's going on in the calendar, which is loaded, because we have to cram in so many weeks. So this week's Parshah is Tzaria. It's a brilliant Parshah. It's one of those Parshas that remind us our position in the Yid learns Torah relationship. Why so? Because although we learn Torah and we go to Shiurim and we open up a Sefer and we try and understand to the best of our ability, which is what the mitzvah is, it's important for us to retain our proper position in that relationship, and that is the Torah that was given and gifted to us. And Matan Torah is really medaberes be'elyonim, umeramezes betachtonim. The Torah really is a work from Olam Atzilus. Torah really is more at home in heavenly matters, but it talks, the language has been translated into language that we talk about. And although we would assume that some mitzvahs, maybe the mitzvahs that you might find in Parshas Mishpatim, buying, selling, earning, borrowing, renting, stuff that we deal with all the time, would be more relevant. Maybe stuff which has to do with relationships are more relevant. Yet the Torah spends so much more time describing the ins and outs of korbanos, of offerings, in the Beis Hamikdash. And in this week's Parsha and next week's Parsha, we have so many details on the halachas of Tumah and Tahara, purity and impurity, which are so abstract. We can't even measure whether somebody is pure or impure other than looking at the signs. I know if I'm hungry. I know if I'm tired. But how do I know if I'm pure or impure? Other than keeping count and looking at all sorts of pointers, but it's not something we can relate to so much. Yeah, but because Torah is really a book, an out-to-worldly book, it's an Olam Atzilus compilation of Hashem. Therefore, it makes much more sense in the world of Atzilus to spend in greater detail the ins and outs of korbanos, of kachim, of taharos, and minimal amount, and sometimes almost zero amount, in the halachas that are so close to how we think. I mean, just think about the halachas of shchita, which are alluded to in the Torah, but are zero details in it. Even Shabbos, mentioned many a time. But how do we know which malachas are considered malachas? These are far less central than the Tahara and the Kachim in the amount of psukim that are dedicated to it. And in this week's Parsha, we get a window into what it looks like to learn Torah from a high madrega. And it's not that we don't understand anything. A lot of it's been explained. But the why and the how come, that's like really challenging. because the Tzaras is one of those really strange ones, over and over again, the ins and outs, and we understand a little bit, and we understand enough to know that there's so much more, layer upon layer. So it's one of those gorgeous parshas that help us understand. Just to bring it back into sync, we are in the third book of the Torah, Sefer Vayikra, and Sefer Vayikra isn't so much pitched as a story of how the world was created, Avraham Avinu, Yitzchak, Yaakov, that was all in Sefer Bereshis, and the Shvatim turn into the Am Yisrael of Mitzrayim and Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the Matan Torah, Kriyas Yamsov, and the Mishkan and the Egel and everything that came with that. That's all Shemais. The bulk of Vayikra is dealing with Karbonis, Kachim, and Taurus. There are many other things as well, sprinkled all around. But the bulk of what we're talking in this Sefer is very much an Olam Atzilus kind of approach, the way it's explained to us here in the here and now. So in that sense, we're very lucky to be in this position now, to be able to be learning this kind of material, especially as we close up on this important time between Adar and Nisan. Because we can, as human beings, stretch our understanding. We can stretch our minds. It doesn't necessarily mean we feel it that way. Our emotions don't necessarily come right away. We can develop that. But our minds, Baruch Hashem, can stretch to understand things that are abstract. And in this week's Tzaria, it does that. It starts off, the beginning of the Parshah Tzaria, is about Isha Kisazria, a woman who gives birth and has a child. And there are halachas of Tahara, at what point is she considered impure, and at what point is she considered pure. And she can do things that cannot be done when a person is in impure state. Interestingly enough, one of the things that help us realize how little we understand into the depth of the Torah is the idea that the mikveh is metahir. A mikveh makes pure, and a shower or a bath that is much cleaner water perhaps, and you come out of it looking shinier, is even metameh, certainly according to Rabbanan, but it certainly doesn't bring tahara. And purity and impurity is a spiritual purity and impurity. And again, as we said earlier, we don't always know what state am I in. It's possible for a person to not know if they are tahar or tameh. Compare that to whether you're hungry or not. Most people can figure out if they're hungry. It's not so hard. They can figure out if they're in a good mood or a bad mood. Maybe it gets distracting, but generally we can figure it out if we have to. Tum and Tahara, it's abstract from us. And the Eibush explains to us how it works. So it starts off with the mitzvah of a woman has after she gives birth and brings a new life into the world. And the tremendous kedusha that comes with that, generating a new life, partnering with the Rebbeinu Shalayla. And of course, the more kedusha one has, the more the impure forces want to grab on. And therefore there has to be an active effort to rid oneself after a growth, after achievement, after doing something so spectacular, to let go of any sort of tumah, impurity that would have been attached to it. And that's the process that we have for both a male child, a boy, and a baby girl, the different processes, and thrown into those psukim, fascinatingly, right here, whilst the Torah is talking to Jewish women, the Torah throws in a mitzvah that isn't even applicable to Jewish women, but it has to do with the baby boy that was born, and it tells us the mitzvah of bris milah. And the Chacham go to town. How come the woman's being told about the mitzvah of bris milah? It's not for her, and she doesn't even have a mitzvah necessarily to do a milah for her son. And of course, they learn, according to a lot of the paskim, that this tells us that if need be, she may perform the mitzvah of milah, as famously the wife of Moshe did for his son. But it's in this week's Tzaria as the Torah is talking to women, and that's the short beginning paragraph of the Torah, Parshah Tzaria. And from there, the rest of the Parsha changes tracks and discusses Sora'as, which is often mistakenly translated as leprosy. Maybe more correct translation would be leprosy-like affliction. And as the Rambam makes it very clear, this was a non-medical issue. This wasn't something you go to the doctor for. If there's tzaras, one goes to the kohen, and the tzaras could appear on one's own body, on one's own skin, different levels of what sort of white color it would be. And the kohen would have a whole process in which the kohen would determine whether the person who had this sort of affliction, this sort of spot, would be considered tameh or tahor. And fascinatingly, even if it was confirmed that it's the right color and it's the right process that would be considered tameh, the individual has not become tameh until the kohen declares him to be tameh. It's almost like the words of the kohen impart the tumah. And then we have, in addition to having on one's own skin, one could also get on one's clothing, and later we'll learn also in one's house. And that's the idea of tzaras, where the Eibishter places an affliction on a person, on their belongings, something that would be an expression of a spiritual disease, and the kohen would declare that this individual has the tzaras, or is belonging as tzaras. And as a result of that, part of the healing process would be that this individual would have to go michutz lamachna, away from the involved encampment, and sit outside of Machne Yisrael. So in the times of the Midbar, that would be outside the entire encampment. In the times of Eretz Yisrael, that would be outside of Yerushalayim. And that's this week's Parshah. The bulk of the Parshah discusses in very great detail, almost like you were reading a Shulchan Aruch, over and over, and in very detail, and more explanation. And as we said, this is such stark contrast to some of the halachas we had in Parshas Mishpatim, the general civil or judicial law that is so dear, there's so little said, and yet there's mountains and mountains of halachas explained on it. Just because we're talking Parshas Tzaria, throw it in there. The Alter Rebbe has a short maimer in the Tzaria that explains how come nowadays people don't get tzaras. And we don't even check. If someone has a lesion of some sort, we go straight to the doctor. That's what the rabbi will tell you. That's what the Rav will say. Because nowadays, we expect there to be no tzaras. And the Alter Rebbe explains that tzaras is actually a spiritual ailment that only appears when it's contrasted against a very, very pure individual. And he points out that the word that opens up this whole discussion is Adam ki yeh ba'or b'sareh. If a human will have in the skin of his flesh. And the Alter Rebbe points out the word Adam, human, is the highest level or title, description you could give to a human being. Adam, Enesh, Gever, I missed one. Adam, Ish, Enesh, Gever. And each one refers to a different madrega of how a human being can behave. The highest form is Adam. And Adam has doesn't have masculine or feminine way of saying it, unlike the other ones, because Adam refers to the core of what the person is. And here, this person who is so at one with his own core or her own core, that's the type of person who, on their very heightened madrega, could develop a tzaras, a skin-leveled spiritual expression of something that could require tikkun. Effectively, what the Alter Rebbe is telling us is that nowadays we're so sunken in madrega, we aren't getting tzaras because it wouldn't even show. It wouldn't even appear on skin. And that also explains why later on we learn that in the times of Mashiach will be called Tzaras Mitzvah de Rabbi. That the Mashiach will be somebody who will allow, his skin will allow the imperfections of his generation and those around him to appear on his skin, is actually a sign of a very heightened individual, because tzaras only appears, as we said, as a spiritual expression in the here and now. Okay, so this is Parshas Tzaria, with the concept of Mitzvah, of how one becomes impure. Starting off the Parsha though, with Tzaria, with a woman who gives birth to a baby boy or a girl, and the mitzvah of Bris Milah. From here, we're going to go now, just for a little bit, exploring what's on the calendar this week, next week, and of course over Pesach, because the time the next year is scheduled for, it's going to be maybe 3 weeks. Let's have a look. So we've got this week, starting off with what's happening tonight. Tonight is Rosh Chodesh. Which Chodesh? Chodesh Nisan. Nisan is spelled Nun Yod Samach Nun. The Gemara tells us if one has a dream and in his dream he sees a Nun, then he's guaranteed a nes will happen. If you see 2 letters Nuns, Nisei Nisim. This is what we're in. Oh boy, does our world need some heavy major Nisim now, urgently. And this is the month. B'Nissen Nigalu Aviseinu, u'B'Nissen Asidin Lihigoyel. There's no better time than now. Rosh Chodesh Nissen. I just want to point out also, as we sit right now here in Manchester, we're Bein HaShmashasing, so we're crossing from 60 days of joy, of double Chodesh Adar. And when they're storming into Chodesh Nissen, it's a brilliant time for the Tekabah Shofar Gadol, for the sound of the big shofar, but it's happening here. Month of Nissen, it's a very joyous time. It's also a time of no Tachanun, starting from tonight. And the reason we don't say Tachanun starting from tonight is because tonight is a special day. In addition to being Rosh Chodesh, it's also the day the first of the Nesiim brought their carbon. We read all about it last week in Parshah Shemini, that Moshe Rabbeinu set up the Mishkan for 7 days leading up to Rosh Chodesh Nissen. And Rosh Chodesh Nissen, it actually went live. Who brought the carbon on the first day? So Aaron was involved in bringing the karbanos, but he didn't only bring the carbon of the regular Mishkan, he brought the carbon of his own inauguration, plus he brought the karbanos of the inauguration of the Mizbeach, starting with the first of the 12 Nesiim, leaders of the tribes of Bnei Yisrael. And the first one tonight and tomorrow, we mark, celebrate, commemorate, and draw energy from Shevet Yehuda. And that's why even if you're a Kohen or a Levi, we say the Hirotzin, we don't forget the Nasi, and that starts with tonight, tomorrow, Rosh Chodesh Nissen. And then the second day is the second Nasi, and the third day, the third Nasi. Because every day, no Tachnun, we celebrate and live with the energy and the koiches that these Nesiim invested into our world, into our reality, to this very day. And perhaps maybe now because of the rush for Pesach, we maybe need this koyach more than ever. And it's here for us. That's exactly what the Nesiim did. They led the people in what they needed. That's what makes a Nasi unique and specific to his Shevet. And then, besides for having the Nesiim every day, starting from tonight, tomorrow, all the way till Yud Beis, and then in Gimel we have Zoyschunks and Mizbeach. This will also include, coming up next week, on Friday, Yud Aleph Nissen, the birthday of our Rebbe, which was a big day. It took a while for the Hasidim to discover when the Rebbe's birthday is, but in the Rebbe's Shnas HaShivim, starting from the Rebbe turned 70, Hashem Lamed Beis, they made a big Farbrengen, and at the 70th birthday, the Rebbe launched, he's going to make 71 new institutions. And the Rebbe mentioned at the Farbrengen that people who were kind and well-meaning people were like sending hints and messages that perhaps now at the ripe old age of 70, he should consider retiring or slowing down. And the Rebbe basically, his response was, in those days it was enormous. Nowadays there's 71 institutions happening, more than that every year. But in those days, to open up another institution, a second institution, 3 institutions, 71 institutions, it was like out of the world. But at that Farbrengen, the Rebbe launched, we're not slowing down, we're racing towards Mashiach, and we're pushing the bar. And then as long as we're active, we can safely say we're in a partnership with Hashem, and then Hashem will make it work. We're going to do the best we can, we're going to push more than we thought that was possible, and Hashem will reciprocate. And this is Yud Aleph Nissen. And we know, or we like to have people remember us on our special day, especially if people reach out and give us something nice. The Rebbe told us very clearly what would be an ideal gift. And the answer is, of course, without saying what the Rebbe dedicated his life to. help another yid do another mitzvah, including myself. Help myself do a mitzvah, help others do a mitzvah. And specifically in learning Torah, increasing in connecting to Hashem through the Torah and making mitzvahs, this is the best, gorgeous gift. And year after year, more and more would gather, and they would do mitzvah tank parades where they would reach out, especially before Pesach, with so many people, you might need reminding to sell off their chametz, which is a simple deal. It doesn't take much, but it has to be done. Even if, chas v'shalom, they might not be keeping Pesach properly, they still should sell their chametz. And equally, of course, the Rebbe's major mitzvah of sharing the handmade, round, shmura matzah. And everybody should have that kind of matzah, at least for Seder night. And it should be made a big deal, of course, to eat matzah. But the matzah should be the original handmade, round, shmura matzah, which is made of shma, and it's shmura, shmartim chemza matzahs. And we should encourage people and help them facilitate that they should have the handmade shmura matzah. These are tremendous things we can do for Yaf Nissen. And that brings us straight into what's going to be on Yud Gimel Nissen, from the Tzemach Tzedek, and Erev Pesach. And of course, 2 weeks tonight, the first Seder night. 2 weeks tomorrow night, the second Seder night. And you have your Chai Nissen, which is the Rebbe's bris, which happened to be the day of his father's Yom Holedus, Reb Leivik's Yom Holedus. And of course, towards the end of Pesach, you have Shvi Shel Pesach, when we celebrate the splitting of the Red Sea, Kriyas Yamsov, and Achron Shel Pesach, Shiach Suda. Hopefully this year will be in Yerushalayim HaKodesh. We'll have fantastic Pesach, and there's lots and lots to look forward to. Even when it gets tough, because we know what we're doing is worthwhile. It keeps it all, instead of being suffering, it's just a challenge. Instead of being a pain, it can be etgar, an opportunity to stretch and to be grown. So that's what we have going on the calendar. That's what we have going on in the Parsha. And now we want to shift our focus to one particular Sikha. It discusses Pesach with loads. We want to walk away with a relevant, practical life message from the Yom Tov of Pesach. What is on these slides? On the slides it tells us a general overview of what Pesach is. I'm going to assume we're going to just skim through. What does it say? Okay, the 20th, we have 8 days of Pesach. The story in a nutshell: we were slaves in Tzaria in backbreaking labor, and Hashem said, "Let my people go," and strike at midnight on the 15th of Nisan in that year 2448. The Yidden were sitting inside having their carbon Pesach, and Hashem killed all the firstborns. And the next day we left, and when we left, we had the dough on our backs without provisions. We went onto the desert. 600,000 males plus many more women and children, all left out into the desert, and they had dough that turned into matzah. What are the mitzvahs that we have for Pesach? What does it say here? 2 main parts. The first 2 days and last 2 days are Yom Tov. We have to have a Suda. We have to have candles. We have to make Kiddush. No working, no driving, no switching on or off electric devices. No, we are permitted to cook and to carry outdoors except on Shabbos. And then you have a second section, which is the middle 4 days. These are called Chol Hamoed. We have a Shabbos this year in the middle. And they're intermediate in the sense that they are still Yom Tov. And we cannot do things just because. But as long as we're doing festive stuff, then we can do things for that day. We shouldn't go to work. And we shouldn't do things that are going to be only for afterwards. But most forms of work are permissible for Yom Tov itself, for Pesach itself. Okay, throughout Pesach, we have no chametz. And that starts already from the 14th, from Erev Pesach. And we have to clean our house. We have to have bdikas chametz. Okay, what other halachas have we got here? Instead of chametz, eat matzah, flat unleavened bread. It's a mitzvah to partake in matzah on 2 Seder nights. Oh, very important. The Seder nights, it's not just that you have to have a meal. One must eat matzah. It's a positive command. And it's not just that we can't have chametz. That first night there must be eating of matzah. If someone can't have gluten, it's a very expensive deal, but there are gluten-free matzahs. And the highlight of the Pesach is the Seder, which is observed the first 2 nights of the Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz. Seder is a 15-step family-oriented tradition and a ritual-packed feast. Oh, I love the description. Okay, moving right into the Sikha. The question the Sikha kind of addresses is why put yourself through the grueling process of climbing the mountain of personal growth when you'll never reach the summit anyway? So, I think this is a layered question. And for some people, this question is resoundingly loud. For some people, they think, it's not even such a strong question. But imagine someone was really bothered by this question. I'm never going to be the ideal kid my mother was wishing for. My mother would never be proud of me. So is there any reason to even try? You know what? Leave my mother alone. I'm never going to be the person I want to be. I'm certainly not going to be the person Hashem wants me to be. So what's it all about? Why am I even trying? And if you can convince me to try, talk to me, tell me what would you say? How would you convince me to do something if it's I'm never going to get there anyhow? Help me out. Please unmute.
That's a difficult one. Like for your own personal satisfaction, wouldn't you want to try and do something?
Do what? Half-baked sausage?
Now. Anything. I mean, if there's something that you feel is insurmountable, you have to work your way through it to see if you can do it. And with a bit of luck, you will succeed. But that does mean, I think, having kind of faith in yourself as well as Hashem. Right. So you can have faith in Hashem, but you can still feel that you may not be able to do it. But you can also have faith in Hashem, and then you know that you can do it because of the faith you have.
Wow. But what I'm hearing you say is that we should have more faith in ourselves and in Hashem, and the truth is we can do it. We can. So when I've assumed that I'll never reach the summit anyhow, effectively what we're saying is maybe you can. Not only maybe you can, if you have enough faith, then you certainly can. Which is powerful. But on the other hand, it also tells me that if I don't make it to the summit, then I'm right in assuming that I'm wasting my time.
No, because at least you would have tried. If you don't try, then you'll never know. It's okay. Everything in life you have to try it. It's not for other people. It's for you.
Very
it's
good.
For you yourself. For other people, it can be for other people. But you yourself have got to be strong enough within yourself to be able to try something.
Right. So we have to be willing to push ourselves, even if it's not going to impress others around us. But for my own good, for my own self, for my own growth, I should push myself and have faith in the individual that I am, and the Hashem's koich is amazing. Let's see how the Sikha deals with this. And I think the Sikha is going to say along the lines also that it's not all or nothing. But jumping right in, starting off with a fascinating left field discussion, which maybe requires a little bit of introduction. But we're going to say it. The reason why I like the Sikha particularly is because it questions Chabad. It's almost like we play devil's advocate for a little bit. And we say, hold on 1 second. If this is the Chabad Pesach, if this is what Lubavitch does, so how does it make sense to be Lubavitch? How does it make sense to follow what the Rebbeim have taught us? And of course, the answer is better than the question, so don't leave after the question. Hang on for the answer. But I like this kind of Sikha because what it tells us is that you not only the kids should be asking Manishtana at the Seder because we have a ready prepared answer for them, we should be asking all the questions we have. And we should know that there's going to be an answer somewhere, and even if we don't have it, we should still ask. But here's the question the way it was asked to the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe was asked this question about what's the deal with gebroks. Now, don't ask me where the word gebroks comes from, but I can tell you what it's supposed to mean. In Hebrew, the word is shruya, and gebroks is in Yiddish, I believe, but it means having wet matzah. Wet matzah? Why? Who wants to have soggy matzah? Some people do. For example, you make your matzah brai, and you take your matzah and you dip it into an egg and you fry it. It's delicious. Or you have matzah balls in your soup. Or you have another type of wet matzah. Dip your matzah into, eat it with a sandwich. So for the most part, the Chabad custom, as is many Hasidic circles, is to avoid matzah shruya, to avoid gebroks. For the first 7 days of Pesach, there is very extreme measures taken to make sure that the matzah doesn't get wet. Almost like if the matzah were to get wet, we would look at it as if it became chametz. Now, just to put it into perspective, the closest thing we have to chametz on Pesach, or to say in different words, the most risky food we eat in the Pesach halachas is without a doubt matzah, because matzah is made out of flour and water. Wheat flour, or whichever flour we're using, isn't used in any other of our Pesach dishes, because we're so conscious that flour can so easily become chametz. Yet with matzah, every single matzah is made with flour and water, which is the exact ingredients that creates chametz. Of course, we do it very carefully, and we do it very quickly, and we make sure that it's kosher lePesach, and we make sure it's made in advance, and we don't take a risk, and you have the professionals make it, we don't do it ourselves, no problem. But it's very risky gear. So how can we allow ourselves to eat it? Because once it's gone into the oven, once it's baked, it no longer rises. I mean, you can see this in your own house. How she once tried to make challah and forgot to let it rise. But I really remembered after it was baked, it was too late to let it rise then. It was just a solid rock. It wasn't the challah. It was very, I don't know if you've ever tried this, but it becomes very heavy. And that's, once it's baked, it's not going to rise. And that's why our matzahs are safe to eat on Pesach, because they have already been baked. And once it's baked, you can turn off the counter. You don't have to race anymore because it's already safe. So then why are we worried about making it wet? How's it going to become chametz if it's already baked? And this was the question that was asked to Alter Rebbe, and this question is leading us towards the original opening question that we said. Some growth, even if it won't take us to the summit, even if it's just a slice of it. Let's see how the Alter Rebbe deals with the Gebroks question. The text one is on your screen. I have read all that you have written in your letter, and I close it with a brief response regarding the issue of cooking crumbled matzah. So you want to make a matzah ball, you want to put it in together, your knedelach, you want to make your matzah meal, mix it together and put it in your soup. And on Pesach, the minhag is, Chabad minhag that is, we don't do that. So, chametz for sure not. But here we're going beyond and above and beyond, and we say you can't even have wet matzah. You can't even have your matzah ball. It's the yom tov of matzah. When else are you going to have matzah balls? Not on Pesach. So it says the Alter Rebbe, I'll explain to you why. The truth is, there is no outright prohibition against doing so. Nevertheless, one who acts stringently shall receive blessings. This is not a ridiculous stringency without any basis. Rather, it's a strong basis for observing this stringency, namely, avoiding the possibility of transgressing the biblical prohibition against eating chametz. Now, the Dot explains why the prohibition against eating chametz is so extreme, and it works in two ways. Number one is because it's very, very serious if you measure by the punishment. And the punishment gives us an indication of how much Hashem doesn't want us to eat chametz on Pesach. And number two is, equally, the level of stringency the Torah places on how careful we must be about anything that came close to being contaminated with chametz helps us appreciate just how serious chametz on Pesach is. So because there's such an extreme mitzvah to not eat chametz on Pesach, therefore it does make sense to be extra careful about not having wet matzah. Says the Alter Rebbe, we can plainly observe that many times flour remains on the surface of some matzahs even after they have been baked. This happens because the dough was tough and was not kneaded thoroughly. And this minute amount of flour that is on the matzah can become chametz. If the piece of such a matzah are placed into soup, as many are accustomed to doing, one can inadvertently transgress a biblical prohibition. So just to put it into context, we did say that once matzah is baked, it can no longer become chametz. But that assumed that the flour was first mixed with water and then baked. Flour that was not yet mixed with water and it was instead put into the oven as it was flour is still flour. It's not yet a baked dough. It's still plain flour. And plain flour, if that gets wet, can still become chametz. So if there's any flour, a pocket of flour that wasn't well mixed, or there's still flour on the external, wherever it is, that has not yet become a dough, and therefore baking it doesn't lock it. And if it gets wet, it could still rise. Well, that seems quite far-fetched. Says the Alter Rebbe, don't forget just how serious the Torah considers chametz. And therefore, even if it's not common, but if it's possible, then it means it's a good enough reason to be careful. Now, I do want to say, today's modern matzah bakeries really don't have this problem half as much as perhaps it was in previous generations. Baruch Hashem, with the amount of machinery, or the word is tools, utensils that we have, and they're very well built. So generally, it tends to be that the flour that we get and the water that we use and the utensils that we use allow them to knead and mix the dough very well. But it's still a possibility. And for that reason, the Alter Rebbe says one should be very careful not to eat matzah shruya. So, matzah shruya, or gebroks in Yiddish, is because of the concern of loose flour from the matzah coming into contact with water, even after it's been through the oven. And if it hasn't become a dough first, and it's only becoming a dough now, the counter only starts now. And therefore, can become chametz. Many communities avoid getting matzah wet on Pesach, and that's why, at least in my house growing up, we couldn't even eat matzah by the table. You have to push your chairs back, and the matzah went inside a bag so that the crumbs shouldn't sprinkle anywhere. And that's, Baruch Hashem, how my mommy did it. Text 2. The Rebbe tells us in this Psicha, we are extremely careful to avoid consuming matzah shruya. Therefore, the matzahs on the table are covered at all times, so that water does not spill onto them. Before we pour water or any other liquid that is mixed with water into a cup or a bowl, we inspect the cup or bowl to ensure that there are no crumbs of matzah in it. When we wash our hands during and after the meal, we don't pass our wet hands over our lips in case there's matzah crumbs on our lips and our hands are wet, and maybe a crumb of matzah will become wet and then become chametz. Just a fun fact again, which type of crumb should we be more wary of? The black crumbs or the white crumbs? And of course the answer is the black crumbs are burnt. They're already no longer becoming chametz. The white crumbs might still have flour in it, and those are the ones we want to watch out for, more so than the black crumbs. But they say it is the same. If there's any matzah remnants left, we don't bring water, which is why we tend to leave the matzah covered, and we're very careful, almost to the extent of considering it like making chametz, to not have gebroks happen on our tables, if we can help it. Here is the interesting part, because the same Alter Rebbe who earlier told us why we should be so careful, and that makes a lot of sense to be strict, says, nevertheless, one who is lenient on the final day of the Yom Tov, for the sake of rejoicing on the holiday, has nothing to lose. The same Alter Rebbe, the same matzah, the same concerns. Somehow, on the last day of Pesach, nothing to lose. Joy of Yom Tov, joy of the holiday. Go right ahead. Gebroks it. My saintly father, Rebbe Rashab, says in the previous Rebbe, was particular, specifically, eat matzah shruya on Achron Shal Pesach. The entire Pesach, he was particular to not eat matzah together with any type of food. But on Achron Shal Pesach, he would do so deliberately, exhibiting this custom in public. He would eat matzah with fish, with the soup, with the meat. At every course, he would mix in matzah so it should be clear and obvious. Not only clear and obvious, but it should be actively gebroksing the whole Achron Shal Pesach. So here's the question, and the question is, why do Hasidim specifically eat the matzah with every food on the last day of Pesach, taking the Alter vicinity to an extreme. So although it did say that it's okay, you haven't lost anything, Chassidim usually do more than Flimishers a day. What's going on here and why the extreme flip, change of tracks from being the most careful to all of a sudden deliberately making the matzah shuya? What's going on behind it? And this is a question that's a very technical question, because if you've been around a Chabad family, you kind of notice this. But actually, the answer to this question is quite a deep answer. Deep as in not complicated, but deep in the sense that it lends meaning to so much of what we do over Pesach. We're not going to learn more halachas or different ways or different things we should do during Pesach, but it's going to allow us to appreciate why we do what we do in a lot of things. This is just a answer that the Sikha says. Don't think it's because Helvanofik, like the Hadas. Okay, let's keep going. Says text 6 from the Sikha. The first day of Pesach is our holiday commemorating how Hashem liberated us from Mitzrayim. This was the first redemption, and it was carried out by Moshe, Goyal Rishon, the first Redeemer. That was the beginning. The last day of Pesach, as we just read, is the day we eat kaproks. The final day of Pesach is our holiday celebrating the future redemption, when Hashem will send Mashiach to liberate us from our current and final exile. And Mashiach will be the final Goyal Acher, and the final Redeemer. So in summary, the first day of Pesach is Moshe's day of celebration, and the final day of Pesach is Mashiach's day of celebration. Okay? Building block number 1. We're trying to figure out why Hasidim are makpid, deliberately eat wet matzah on the last day of Pesach, after we've learned how serious and careful we should be all the other days of Pesach. So the first step is to put things into their places, understanding that the first days of Pesach, we're celebrating with Moshe. The last day of Pesach, we're celebrating with Mashiach. How so? So here's a couple of ideas throughout Chassidus, a massive deal of how the last days of Pesach are connected to Mashiach. But starting off with the Haftarah of Achron Shal Pesach, the Yatsa Gazim Mechayta Yishai, and the shoot shall spring forth from the stem of Yishai, and the twig shall sprout out from his roots. Yishai was the grandfather of David, the father of David, and he's the grandfather of Mashiach. And the spirit of Hashem shall rest upon him, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and heroism, a spirit of knowledge and fear of Hashem. And he shall be animated by the fear of Hashem, and neither with the sight of his eyes, and of his eyes shall he judge, nor with the hearing of his ears shall he chastise. And he shall judge the poor justly, and shall chastise with the equity with the humble of the earth, and he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth and the breath of his lips, and he shall put the wicked to death. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and the faith the girdle of his loins. Clearly, the Haftarah is talking about Mashiach, which explains also why the final day of Pesach is the day in which we celebrate the future redemption by having a Sudas Mashiach. As the Baal Shem Tov famously told us, it was the custom of Baal Shem Tov to partake of 3 meals on the last day of Pesach, and the last of these meals was called Mashiach Suda. Baal Shem Tov tells us, the festive meal of Mashiach. From the last day of Pesach, the radiance of Mashiach is openly revealed. Now, there's a lot to say about why and how the last day of Pesach is connected to Mashiach, but in Halacha, we find Haftarah that way. In Chassidus, we find it so much so that the Baal Shem Tov even made a Mashiach Suda on that day, and the idea of having a Yom Tiv of Mashiach, a celebration of Mashiach, compared to the celebration of the first days of Pesach, which are the days of Moshe, will help us appreciate what shifts between the early days of Pesach and the last day of Pesach, which is Mashiach Day. And that will explain why the eating of shruya, of gebroks, of wet matzah, isn't just something we can get away with, but it's something we are encouraged to do. And just to jump the gun, just to ruin it, we shouldn't have a total surprise. the idea of having gebroks, in a way, is a halachic taste of eating chametz. Now, God forbid, chas v'shalom, we're not going to eat chametz. But we're heading into this space, into the zone of where we can start partaking in the areas that were off limits and beyond reach during Pesach. Come Acharon Shel Pesach, the last day of Pesach, as we start celebrating with Mashiach, we've gone up to a level, to what used to be impossible, has now become a little bit more possible. And even though it's not everything, it is something. And that something is worth pursuing completely, because it's something that we can do. Even though there's so much more to achieve, because it's something, and we can do that something, that's what we're going to focus on 100%. And we're going to do it deliberately, actively. And that's going to be the concept of gebroks, of shrir. So let's make as if we didn't say what we just said, and let's see how we build up towards what happens when we celebrate Mashiach on the last day, and how that is going to equal an understanding of why the Rabbein taught us to deliberately have shrir. Okay, so starting off with the contrast, Mashiach celebration on the last day, final day, and the Moshe celebration of the Starim, the first days. Here we go. Says the same Yeshaya Navi. What's it going to look like? Mashiach comes in through the door. The Kaaba Shofar, God here, sound like big shofar. And then, for not with haste shall you go forth, and not in a flurry of flight shall you go. Hashem goes before you, and your rear guard is the God of Israel. We won't be running. We won't be escaping. We won't be dashing. Instead, we'll go with Hashem. And we'll march out. We'll march to Geulah. We won't go racing, rushing out of Golus like they did when they left Mitzrayim. Remember what it says, how they were rushing out? They had the doughs on the back and they didn't have time to bake it because they had to get out of there now. Not Mashiach comes. What's going on? So Zechariah Hanavi describes also about Mashiach. Says Zechariah Hanavi, and it shall come to pass in that day, Noam Hashem Tzvaka is in the name of Hashem, Lord of hosts, says Zechariah. I will cut off the names of the idols from the earth, and they shall no longer be mentioned. And also the false prophets. And listen to this, the spirit of impurity, the entire concept of being able to have distraction and negation to Hashem, the spirit of impurity, I will remove from the earth. So not only bad things and bad people and bad stuff, the concept, the ruach of all tumah, the spirit of impurity shall be removed as well, says Zechariah Navi. That describes the time of the Gola Ha'achrin, of Mashiach times. So if we just compare with some pictures, the Exodus from Egypt, we ran from the evil. It was enmeshed, it was so part of our own identity. We needed to break free. We needed to break out. And we couldn't stick around. The fire was on our heels. Compare that to the future redemption. We won't run. The world will already be transformed into a holy place. We're not running. The world is coming with us. We're not going to somewhere else. We're not going to some other tra-la-la land where everything's all fine and dandy. This is where Mashiach's coming to, the here and now. Of course, we won't make our way to Yerushalayim, but not because Yerushalayim is somewhere else, because this world will be a place that will be obvious, where Yerushalayim is where everyone wants to be. And therefore, there's no running away. Here is where Mashiach is coming to. And if we put that into the first day of Pesach to the last day of Pesach, in the first day of Pesach, any level of chametz must be eradicated completely. Any vestige of Mitzrayim, run away. Anything that's distracting, switch it off. Let go of it. It's way too risky. Slippery slopes. And that's what it was like leaving Mitzrayim. As the Alter Rebbe explains, who were they running away from when they left Mitzrayim? Who was chasing them out of Egypt? Why couldn't they stay and bake their bread? Why did they run? Well, they were scared that Pharaoh was going to change his mind. He just had all death to the firstborns. He wasn't going to change his mind anytime soon. He was a broken nation. So why were they running? And the answer was they were running away from themselves. It was so enmeshed into their own personality, the courage it took for them to say, you know what? We are going to become Hashem's people. We are going to let go of the glitz and the excitement of being part of the superpower of the underworld, of Mitzrayim. We're going to break out and we're not going to be slaves. That courage was very, very at risk. And therefore they had to run away from the at-risk situation they were in. That compared to a life of recovery, of transforming every turn, twist and turn, and every distraction into an opportunity. Now Chametz is transformed to holiness. In the last days of Pesach, it's not Chametz, Chas v'Shalom, God forbid, but that's where we're headed. Now we've assumed that the idea of Chametz isn't bad, it's evil, and matzah is holy. And the short of it is, Chametz and matzah, Chametz is the inflated bread, puffed up, and the matzah is the flat bread. What's wrong with being inflated and puffed up? Having a healthy sense of self is very good, but it's also risky. What's risky of a puffed up sense of self? If I think I am me because of me, if I think I have my own achievements because I'm just me and I'm the greatest, or I'm so good just because of me, it's very dangerous. Because people around me, and certainly the Rebbeinu Shalom, not only take a back seat, but very quickly become the enemy because they're challenging me. And that's the danger of having an inflated ego, an inflated self, a sense of self. So much so Chazal tell us that most of the problems that human beings have start off with an unhealthy ego. For sure, it's things like anger and hatred, but even other things, temptation and lust, and the hardships we find in doing mitzvahs start off with an unhealthy sense of self, looking for our own self-gratification, instant gratification, without the ability of understanding something deeper. It's an unhealthy sense of self that drives it. And in a sense, Chametz is exactly that. And that's why when we leave Mitzrayim on the first night of Pesach, not only do we not eat Chametz, but we don't want to have anything that might even resemble something similar to maybe having a connection to Chametz, including wet matzah shruya. Then, in the celebration of Mashiach, at that time, we don't want to run away from the Chametz. We want to transform it step by step. Now, for most people, that's very impossible. It's out of reach to say that I can take all the negative, or in Yiddish, the schmutz, that I stay clear away from, and not have to stay away. I can get involved in the schmutz and I'll be okay. That's not realistic, and it's not what we should do in a time of Godless. But as we get closer towards the times of celebrating Mashiach, that's actually where we're headed. And that's why Gebrox isn't Chametz, but it symbolizes, it's the concept of where we go to a place because halachically this is okay, where we're headed towards a place of where we are working with the here and now, even if it's maybe chametz related. It's not chametz chas v'shalom, but gebrox is something that we want to be able, we wish to be able to work with, to not have to escape from. And that's exactly what celebrating with Mashiach looks like. No part of this world, no part of this universe won't be part of the tremendous goodness of Hashem that Geula is. And as we get to Achron Shal Pesach, in which we celebrate Geula, that's what we have to bear in mind. Gebrox. So now we've explained why. You know what? Let's do it slowly. We've explained why we eat gebrox deliberately on Achron Shal Pesach, because it's an aspiration that we're headed towards. And once we are able to eat gebrox, as the Alter Rebbe says, you haven't lost anything, comes along the Rebbe Rashab, and he deliberately puts himself and his followers and us into a place where we can do what we can. Here's a quote from the Zohar. When the Jews were in Egypt, they became sullied and corrupted by all the forms of impurity, to the point that they were under the influence of 49 powers of impurity. That's what it looked like as we left Mitzrayim. We escaped at the skin of our teeth. But then for the next 7 weeks, 7 times 7, we worked our way up, cleansed, and through Sfira So'imah, we refined ourselves until we reached the time of Shavuos. And at the time of Shavuos, we were a refined people. And that explains why the mitzvah on Shavuos is to bring one of the only times in the year that chametz was brought as an offering by the people to Hashem. Chametz generally was not allowed in the Beis Hamikdash, except when it was Shavuos. Not only were they eating chametz themselves, the carbon that they brought consisted of chametz. Why? Because at the end of the day, if I look myself in the mirror and I see a negative trait looking back at me, so the first step is stay clear. Run away. Let go. Don't be defined by it, because it's a negative trait. And that's celebrating with Moshe. And the very first thing is to make sure my behavior is in check. The next step is don't stop there. Try and aim towards more than that. And what's more than that? And that's the next step. The next step is, as we break free, through the process of self-refinement, our inflated bad ego is transformed to good ego and pride in Hashem's pride. And all of a sudden, that which was a chain holding me back now becomes wings to help me fly. The baggage that was dragging me down becomes the fuel to propel me forward. And that is where we're headed. But it's out of reach. There's so much of the time. But as soon as some of it comes into reach, do what I can. And do it with chayas, with excitement, with passion. Where's it gone? On the last day of Pesach, when we have already refined one attribute, we've had 7 days of Shir Zomer, we are able and required to use Matzah for the sake of holiness, and therefore, by giving the improvement of a single aspect of your personality full dedication, do it. And throw yourself in. You have the ability to create a small slice of perfection, and although it won't be the full mountain climb, because that's still out of reach, but this one is in reach. And therefore, come Achron Shal Pesach, we eat matzah shroya. Come the night of the Seder, we eat matzah. My personality may be still full of ego, but this I can do. I can have a side, an angle, a corner in my life that is switched on. There's so much more to do. I'm never going to make it. I don't have to think about that. Right now, I can do one thing, and it might be a little thing, but it's something I can do. I do it 100%. And then this small dedication will be a full dedication, and this slice of Ebishter, of Emes, is mine to keep. And it's true that later will also be a catalyst for more. So when we get ready for Pesach, we'll do one day at a time, but not just because we're coping. Not just because we're going to live through it. We'll do one day at a time because this is the avodah. This is the service Hashem wants from me now. And the Achron Shal Pesach idea tells us this is what we do in halacha. Matzah shroya. We wouldn't touch it the whole Pesach. Come Achron Shal Pesach, we throw ourselves into it because that's the new avodah of that day. And every day we celebrate that day. We've learned something. I want to wish everybody a kosher and Felech Pesach. If you know anybody who might have forgotten to sell the chametz, please remind them. Easy links. Chabad.org/chametz. And you go to the local rabbi. But also, if you know anybody who needs a place for a seder, first night or second night, please be in touch. Please do let me know. We would love to host them and you and anybody else who's around. Wishing you all good kosher Felech Pesach. The next year will be the week after Pesach. Bezrat Hashem. Zayt gesund, everybody.